Okay, hello all you crazy people out there. My name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and welcome back to Data Structures in GameMaker. Today it's time to talk about grids. So the grid structure in GameMaker is actually really fascinating. Most people, when they use a DS grid in GameMaker, they just basically use it as a glorified 2D array, and that's completely fine. So if I were to create myself a DS grid, and I'm gonna call it, let's just call it G, for reasons which you will see later. I'm gonna say G equals DS grid create. Unlike some of the other data structures in GameMaker, in fact, unlike all of the other data structures in GameMaker, when you say DS grid create, you can't just close parentheses and be done with it. You need to specify a size of the grid, so let's give it a width and a height. Let's give it, for example, 10 on the width and 15 on the height. Okay, and then, as always, when we're done with it, we can DS grid destroy, and that will prevent any memory leaks from accumulating. As always, when you're done with the data structure, either at the end of the script that you're using it in, or perhaps in an object destroy event or something like that, you should always destroy it so that it doesn't hang around in memory. And after that, you are free to use this as a 2D array if you so wish. So you can do things like, say, DS grid set. You can set the value of G at maybe x equals 3, y equals 4 to, I don't know. This can be, as always, any data type. It can be a string. It can be a number. Let's make this like, pick your favorite number. And then after that, you can retrieve the value with DS grid get, and you can again supply the grid, supply the coordinates. The value of every cell in the grid will initialize to 0. So if you were to look up a cell in the grid which you have not yet set a value to, it'll just be 0. So for example, let's say grid cell 1, 2 is going to have a value of 0. If I were to show that message, the value in the cell that I just set, 3, 4, however, will be whatever I set it to, so 1337. If I were to run this game, we're going to see that the first value at position 1, 2 in the grid is going to be 0, and the second value, the one at position 3, 4 in the grid, is going to be 1337. Okay, that's pretty elite if you ask me. And from here on out, you are perfectly free to use a DS grid as a glorified 2D array. There is nothing wrong with that. Plenty of people do it. You also have the grid accessor, which you can use if you do not feel like typing out DS grid get and DS grid set all the time. And that symbol for this accessor is going to be the number sign. And using the number sign accessor for the DS grid is going to allow us to read and write from cells without having to type all that out. So we could say show message G number sign at position 3, 4, or G number sign 1, 2. And when I run this time, the exact same thing is going to happen. So the first value is going to be 0. The second value is going to be 1337. So the size of the grid is fixed, unlike with arrays or lists. If you were to try to read or write something from outside the bounds of the grid, it would not work. If I were to try to read, if I were to try to first write to cell 30, 4, which is outside the bounds of the size of the grid, and then later read from it, that is not going to go over super well. We're going to see 0 because that is the result of 1, 2, and then we're also going to see undefined because that is outside the bounds of the grid. And if you look down on the console, you will see a little warning popping up as well that you are trying to read or write from the outside of the bounds of the grid. A list or an array in GameMaker will automatically resize if you try to write from it. If you try to read from it, it'll just give you undefined. I believe arrays might actually crash. But grids will explicitly warn you that you cannot do that. If you want to resize a grid, you could say DS grid resize, and that is going to allow us to set a new size for the grid. So we will be able to, let's say, give it a new size of maybe 40, 15, and that is going to cause grid index 30, 4 to be a valid index. So we can run the game now. You know, I can get rid of this first line. 0, don't care about that anymore. And after we've resized the grid, 30, 4 is indeed a valid index, and we have no warning messages popping up down there. When you resize a grid, if you resize it upwards, any new cells that were added will be initialized to 0 as they were when you created it. If you size a grid down, so if you make it smaller than the original grid, then any data that was on the outer rows or columns of the grid will just be lost. Be careful of that. Now, this is where this video is going to diverge a little bit from the previous data structures videos that I've created. I am going to let's say comment out this game end, and I am going to run the game. And if you've been following my YouTube channel for a long time, you may recognize this. This is vintage 2014 Dragonite Spam YouTube GameMaker tutorial material. And this is where DS grids start to really get interesting. So in addition to using these things as glorified 2D arrays, you can use DS grids to do a little bit of math. And you can use DS grids to do bulk operations. So what you see on the screen right now is a little program that I wrote back in 2014 to demonstrate the functionality of DS grids, which I think is actually quite a bit cooler than 18-year-old me really gave it credit for being. So if you were to type out DS grid underscore and then hit Control Space to see a dropdown of all the functions built into GameMaker that you can do with DS grids, you will see quite a few things. A lot of the other GameMaker data structures only had a couple functions that you could use, like set, get, read, write, push, pop, NQ, DQ, that sort of thing. Grids actually have quite a lot. There's quite a lot of math functions that you can do on a grid. So first off, if we were to say DS grid set, you would see that there are actually a couple different DS grid set related functions. So we have DS grid set disk, we have DS grid set grid region, that's a mouthful, we have DS grid set region. These functions are all for setting multiple values in a DS grid at the same time. So when it comes to grids, you can operate on regions that are rectangular, or you can operate on regions which are circular. If you want to clone this GitHub repository and play around with this little project, the two icons that are the square and the big O are for setting a rectangular region versus a circular region. The code is a little bit awkward. I wrote this like 7 years ago. And there's a couple more buttons down here at the bottom that is for doing bulk operations on the grid. So you can set data, you can multiply, you can get some statistics, and so on and so forth. I have not implemented these yet. I will be doing that in this video. If you click this button with the circle, nothing's going to happen. The one that's labeled set data. I could stand to make that tooltip a little bit bigger so that it's a little bit easier to read. Anyway, I'm going to do that now, or at least let me get rid of that so that it doesn't crash the game if I try to run it. If I come over here and if I go into the object names, click set down here, user event 0 is where all of the code that actually happens when you click on one of the buttons is stored. In modern day GameMaker, this would probably be a method. In GameMaker 8, this was a user event. So if I were to go into the region rectangle section of this if-else tree and start typing ds grid set region, ds grid set region is going to take a couple parameters. It is going to take a grid, which I'm just going to call grid, which is apparently a global variable, which I created when I first wrote this 7 years ago. Would not recommend. This function takes a few more values, which are going to be x1, y1, and x2, y2. These are the two corners of the rectangle in the grid, in the region that we want to set. These are inclusive, so the x1, y1 values that we are going to be feeding into this thing are going to be likewise a couple more variables that I built into this program. I'm going to call them start I and start j. Again, global variables would not recommend in code that you actually intend to use. And x2 and y2, these are the endpoints in the rectangle. I can say end I minus 1 and j minus 1. And the value that we're going to set, this can be whatever we want. Let's make it 10. Close off that function. I'm going to run the game again. This is going to run. If I were to select a region and click the set data button, we are going to set all of these squares to 10. If you wanted to, which is sort of the intended behavior of this program, I can say var val is going to be equal to get integer. This is just going to show a message asking the user for a number. I'm going to call that string value to set, which is going to be in the message box, and the default value can be 0. And then instead of setting the value of ds grid set region to 0 or to 10 or whatever it was, I'm just going to set it to val, which is the value that we got from the user. So now I can run this again. I can select a region. I can click set data. Let's feed it, let's say 100 or so, and the colors of the squares will change. I can set this region to something else. How about 400 or so? Okay, and you can see that the cells in the grid have indeed been updated. If you wanted to, for example, erase these, you can set the entire region to 0 again. Okay, that's fun. Next, let's look at ds grid set disk. ds grid set disk. This is going to be similar to dsGridSetRegin, but instead of taking a start and an end, we are going to instead take some circular parameters. So we're going to set the grid that we're going to deal with to grid. XM and YM are the center of the circle, the center of the circular region, the center of the disc-shaped region that you would like to set the values of. You can say start I, start J. I believe I might want those to be -1 for reasons that you will see in a minute. The R is the radius of the circle, the radius of the disk. Again, let's just set this to 10 for the time being. I believe I might want those to be -1 both as well for reasons that we shall see in a minute. R is the radius of the circle. In this program, that's going to be hard-coded to start_radius, which is just going to be the radius of the circular selection region that I've got. And value, again, for the time being, let's make this like 100 or so. Actually, you know what? Hang on. Fine, wait. I'm just going to select the circular region. Let's set the data, and we can see that the contents of this approximately circular region has been set to 100. And you can see there is a bit of an off by 1. That is why I said I might want a -1 on each of these. But nevertheless. So, let's see. What I really should do is use the same value in getInteger when I set the value of the circle. So now, if I were to create myself a circular region, set data, let's give it a new number. Let's give it 250. Okay, now we've got an off by 1 in the other direction. That's fine. Anyway, everything in this circular region has been set to 250. So if I were to select myself, let's say a rectangular region, let's give you 100. We can see that we are cutting out sections of this grid. That's fine. We understand how this works. So that's dsGridSet. The other dsGrid setting function, dsGridSetGridRegin. This is for if you want to copy part of a grid to another grid. This I'm not going to really talk about. The short explanation is that instead of specifying a starting x, a starting y, an ending x, an ending y, and a value that you want to set the region to, you would instead supply the region size as well as a reference to the source grid, as well as a reference to the position on the source grid. That would allow you to copy one part of a grid to another. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Instead, we also have some other functions, dsGrid, let's say add. And this will add a value into whatever already exists in the dsGrid. And likewise, we have dsGrid add, we have dsGrid add disk, we have dsGrid add grid region. Again, that's for dealing with copying values from one grid to another, and dsGrid add region. Those functions take very much the same form as dsGrid set, the only difference being that instead of setting a value, you're adding to whatever's already there. And I actually do not have a button for this in this demo program, so that's already been created, and I'm going to just I think go into the room editor and add one. Let's see, click add, I believe, is the button that I'm looking for. And if I were to open up the user event 0 of click add, we can say dsGrid add region. And again, this is going to take very much the same form as the dsGrid set functions do. So I can say grid start I, start j, end I -1, and j -1. And the value that we're going to add, let me just copy this this getInteger line of code from the set button, and we are going to add whatever value the user supplies to this region. And likewise, dsGrid add disk is our other one. This can take grid start I -1, start j -1. The radius is start radius, and the value again is going to be val. Okay, so now I can run this. I can create myself a region. Let me mouse over not set before reading it. Did I not correctly? Oh, you know what I didn't do? I did not define the tooltip that this add data button would use. In modern GameMaker, that would be something like a variable definition. In GameMaker 8, that had to be creation code, which I had to remember to set. So we can add some data to each of these cells. I'm going to add 50 to each of these, so 0 plus 50 is 50. If I were to select another region and add, let's say, 75 to each of these, the cells that were already 0 are going to now contain the value of 75. The cells that were already 50 plus 75 is 125. So this overlapping section is going to be 125. We've added a little bit to this region. If I were to do it again, let's say add 100. And we can see again the values in each of these cells in that region in this dsgrid are being added to. Next, there are some other functions. We have dsgrid multiply. And I suppose I should also mention, in addition to adding to a disk in a region, you can also dsgrid add to any given cell. This isn't especially useful because for this situation, you could very easily just dsgrid set grid x y dsgrid get grid x y plus something. You could very easily implement this yourself. The add disk and add region functions do save you from having to write a little bit of code in a loop, and they're also faster than doing it in native GML because GML is slow and the engine's code is fast. But if you do want, there is dsgrid add for a single cell, which you can use if you so want to. Anyway, as I was getting to next, dsgrid multiply. We have dsgrid multiply for, again, a single cell. We have dsgrid multiply disk for a circular region on a grid. We have dsgrid multiply grid region for multiplying cells in a grid by values copied from another grid. And we have dsgrid multiply region, which is for multiplying a rectangular region in a grid by a single value. So I can go into the click multiply button up here. I am going to just start copying and pasting things because this is starting to get a little bit tedious. The value is going to be, where am I? The value is going to be obtained from the user. Let's see, the disk version of this function is going to be, instead of dsgrid add disk, dsgrid multiply disk with, again, same form as set and add, but just does a slightly different operation. And dsgrid multiply region is going to take the same form as dsgrid add region, but the name is going to be multiply instead, and the operation that it performs is going to be multiplication instead of addition. So I am going to need to actually set the values in this grid to something first, because multiplying anything by 0 is just going to be 0, which is not going to be super exciting. Let me set these to like 10 and 15 or something, and then if I were to select, let's say this subregion here, and multiply by, I don't know, 45 or so, we can see that 10 times 45 is going to be 450. All of the cells that previously contained 10 and got multiplied are now 450. And whatever I had before, because I've already forgotten what it was, multiplied by 45, I think it was 15, is going to be apparently 675. Okay. And this is going to work if you wanted to do this for the entire region. Multiply the whole thing by 10. Do it again. I accidentally multiplied by 0, and apparently there's some undefined argument there. Cool. So those are the arithmetic functions that you can do on dsgrids. There is no dsgrid subtract or dsgrid divide. If you wanted to subtract a value from a dsgrid, you would just use dsgrid add and supply a negative number instead of a positive one. If you wanted to do division instead of multiplication, division is essentially multiplication by a reciprocal, so you would do instead dsgrid multiply and then 1 divided by the value that you want to divide by. We do, however, have some statistical functions. We have dsgrid get, and in addition to just dsgrid get, we have a couple statistical functions. We have dsgrid get disk max, dsgrid get disk mean, dsgrid get disk minimum, and dsgrid get disk sum, as well as equivalent versions for dsgrid regions instead of like dsgrid rectangular regions rather than dsgrid circular regions. This will allow us to do some statistics on a DS grid. Unfortunately, some of the fancier things like standard deviation and that sort of thing, I do not believe GameMaker has built-in functions to do. Perhaps that is a feature request that might be worth submitting to Yo-Yo Games, but regardless. So I can go into the, let's see, the stats button in this program. And when you click on the stats button, it'll ask you for a couple. It'll ask you to put in a number. It is going to be the statistical operation that you want to do on the selected region. For example, 1 would be getting the minimum of the selection. If I were to do this and say statistics minimum, 1 would be the minimum, 2 would be the maximum, 3 would be the mean, which is just fancy statistics speak for average, and 4 would be the sum, so the total of every cell in the grid. If I do that now, obviously nothing's going to happen because there is no code implemented in this button. So instead I could say show message ds grid get disk. What's 1? Grid min. So this is going to get the minimum of the grid. The grid is going to be grid. xm is going to be start I minus 1, start j minus 1, and the radius is going to be start radius. This also takes similar form to the other arithmetic functions that we were dealing with, but instead of setting a value, it's retrieving it. And in dsgrid get min over a rectangular region, we are going to be going with start I, start j, and end I minus 1, and j minus 1. Those are going to be our x1, y1, x2, and y2. And we don't need any arguments after that because that is just going to that is just going to get the minimum of this region. And if I were to, let's say, select a region, let us set this to 10 or something. And if I were to select another region and try to get the min, enter a 1, we are going to see that the min is 0. If I were to select a region that's full of 10s and get the min, we are going to see that the min is 10. Okay, and we can do all of the other statistical functions that you can do on a DS grid. Again, take a similar form. So that's going to be the grid min. I mean, the max. If you put in a number 2, 3 is going to be the mean. 4 is going to be the sum. And we shall do the same thing for the circular regions. So 2 is going to be get disk max, 3 is going to be get disk mean, and 4 is going to be get disk sum. And this is going to allow us to do some operations on a DS grid. So if I were to just let me fill this with some arbitrary values. Okay, so I filled in this grid with some arbitrary values. If I were to select a region and let's get the grid, for example, the average value of each of these cells in the grid, we are going to find out that this is 267.59. Okay, that looks reasonable. If I were to instead get the sum, we are going to have a fairly large number. 14,450 is the sum of each of the cells in this region. I'm going to take GameMaker's word for it. Rather than punching all those numbers into a calculator myself and figuring it out myself. If I were to instead select a circular region, we would be able to look up, let's say, the max value in this grid, and I think that should be 500. Okay, indeed, if I were to instead get the average of all these values in this circle, we could see that that is going to be 315.52. Sounds reasonable. And you could mess around with all the other statistical operations on these grid regions. Okay? Lastly, there are a couple functions in DS grids for DS grid exists, DS grid find, DS grid, what is it? DS grid value. These functions are super awkward to use. They're a relic of the days when GameMaker only had the data types of strings and numbers. And they didn't have proper arrays, they didn't have structs, they didn't have pointers, they didn't have anything like that. So if I were to go into the click exists button, this is going to be the last one that we're doing today, I swear. We can use a couple functions, dsgrid, let's see, value disk exists. This is going to take the same arguments as the other dsgrid disk functions. So we could say grid start I minus 1, start j minus 1. The radius is going to be start radius, and the value that we're searching for is going to be t, because apparently I decided to call it that way back when instead of val. And we could show message the value of this. We also have dsgrid value exists, and this is for the regions, so we can say start I, start j, and I minus 1 and j minus 1, and the value that we're searching for again is going to be t. And this is going to allow us to search a rectangular region. So if I were to let's set something to 100, and if I were to select this region and say does stuff exist? Is that really what I decided to call this button? I will never understand my 18-year-old self. If I were to search for the value of 100, we are going to have a 1 popping up in this message box because 1 is true, 0 is false. If I were to instead search for a value of, let's say, 25, we're going to have a 0 popping up in this message box. Again, 0 is false. To be a little bit more helpful, there's a couple other functions that you can use for the dsgrid value exists for the purposes of figuring out if a value exists in a selected region in a dsgrid. You could say if dsgrid value exists, you could say, let's say var x pos is going to equal dsgrid value disk x, and that is going to take the exact same list of arguments. You could say var y pos is going to equal dsgrid value disk y, again taking the exact same list of arguments, and these x pos and y pos are going to be the coordinates in the grid of the first cell in which the value that you're searching for can be found. If these functions were added to GameMaker a decade later than they were, it's highly likely that instead the dsgrid value exists function would just return, for example, either undefined if it doesn't exist or an array containing the x and y. Again, ancient GameMaker. And then we can say show message value found at string x pos, comma, string y pos. Else, we can show message value was not found, or something like that. And before I run the game again, let's implement this for the rectangular region as well. This is going to be dsgrid value x grid. I can just copy and paste the argument list. X pos equals that, and y pos is going to be dsgrid value y, and we can likewise show the message where it was found. Otherwise, we can just say that the value was not found, and that is going to tell us whether or not a certain value exists in a dsgrid. So if I were to let me just set some random jumbles of data and okay, let us search this region for, I don't know, what's a number? 450. Let's search for 450 in this region. And that is going to tell us that the value of 450 is first found at 6, So indexing from 0, we can count those off. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on the vertical, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 450, this cell here, indeed, is the first cell at which 450 can be found. If I were to instead search for a value that is not in this region, let's say maybe 80. There are no cells in this selection which contain the value of 80. This should tell us that the value was not found. Okay, we can select a circle and search for 80. I believe 80 will not be found in the circular region because I believe this one that's sort of partially intersecting the circle would be considered too far outside, but yeah, the value 80 was not found. If we search for something that is a little bit more safely inside the circle, let's say 250, the value should be found, and that's going to be found at 85. And again, you can count that off if you want to. It should go without saying that most of these math functions are only really going to do what you want them to if you give them numbers. If you try to dsgrid add region by, like, I don't know, a struct or an array or something like that, it's obviously not going to work super well. For strings, it may concatenate the string that you gave it onto the end of every string in the grid, but even that's a little, let's just say that's a little out there in terms of what you should maybe be doing with these functions. Obviously, doing statistics dsgrid get sum isn't going to work if you have strings or something else that isn't a bunch of numbers in the grid. The dsgrid value exists function should work for other data types. If you pass in a string, it should let you know if a string could be found at any of these positions. Although, with that said, most of the time, if you were to try to use any of these functions, you would probably be dealing with numbers anyway. Anyway, there are a handful of other helper functions when it comes to dsgrids. I'm just gonna really rattle these off as quickly as I can. dsgrid shuffle is for randomizing a grid, for randomizing the contents of a grid. This is analogous to dslist shuffle, which will randomize the contents of a list. dsgrid read, dsgrid write. As with all the other data structures, if you want to save or load a dsgrid to a string or from a file or something like that, you would use these. I don't really recommend doing that. I'm not going to go over how they work. dsgrid copy. This is for copying the contents of one grid onto another. Again, that's common to all the data structures in GameMaker. That is a more general version of the dsgrid set region function, which would be only for copying part of a grid. dsgrid clear is for erasing a grid, or at least setting it to a single value anyway. dsgrid, let's see, sort is another function, and you can choose, if you imagine a dsgrid as a spreadsheet, you could sort the grid by the values that are in a particular column in the spreadsheet, and you can also specify whether you want it to be in ascending or descending order. That can be useful if you are trying to actually import something as a spreadsheet using the load CSV function. The load CSV function will try to load a file. If it's in CSV format, it'll parse that CSV file into a dsgrid. Essentially, you can think of a CSV file or comp-separated value file as a prototypical spreadsheet. And there are a few other dsgrid functions which you can which are in here somewhere. I don't think I hit them all. Height and width, dsgrid height, dsgrid width. These do exactly what you think they do. They get the height and width of the grid. If there's any other dsgrid related functions that you wish to know more about that I have not talked about, as always, you can either middle click or hit F1 on the function name, and that will open up the manual. And inside the manual, you can go and read about each of the other functions. Okay, so I'm going to stop now. How long have I been recording for? I've been recording for 47 minutes. I'd like to get that under a half hour when I edit this down. If you want the code for this, I will actually have this project in a GitHub repository in the video description. dsgrid math functions. If you want to clone this repository and play around with it, by all means, feel free. If you want to experiment with some of the other grid functions, again, feel free. If you want to clean up this code a little bit and make it look less like 2014 era, I was 18 years old and I'd only been writing computer code for 2 years. Again, feel free. Get rid of all the global variables and such. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, there'll be links to that in all the usual places. You could see your name in the credits. You could hear yourself shouted out at the end of each of these videos. You can get a bit of a preview of my future plans. Otherwise, I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, 1 tutorial, and 1 let's make a game. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Connor, Edward Holt, Emily Koyo, Halo Factory, Posho, Sindra Larson, Tusk, and Zenith for supporting these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits or hear yourself shouted out at the end, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.